I think we should have a conversation about the U.S. stock market to kind of clear up some misinformation. If you're invested in the stock market, you'll probably find it interesting. If you're not invested in the stock market, you'll probably find it maddening. And the thing about the Midas Mighty is that you're spread out all across the world. So you might not think that the U.S. stock market is the be-all, end-all. But there is one thing that holds true. No matter where you are in the world, your central bank or retail investors and institutions from the country that you're in, they're investing in the U.S. stock market. And there's a very, very good reason for that. And I think we're entitled to an honest assessment of why the market can sustain such high values when all we can see is the economy collapsing in real time around us. So first, I'm going to give you the U.S. administration's take on it from none other than smiling goober Kevin Hassett, the economic genius, mind you, who developed the financial model in early 2020, saying that COVID would only last for a few weeks. That guy. And then from one of the most respected figures on Wall Street, Rick Rieder. Now, the first test is to see if you can spot the difference. And then we'll do a little detective work to uncover the grift that keeps on giving in the U.S. stock market. I'm Max from UNFTR, reporting for the MeidasTouch. You can sign up for my free weekly political and economic newsletter at UNFTR.com for deeper economic dives. But for now, just break out the popcorn and let's play Spot the Liar. Here's two guys just, shooting the shit about how great things are in the world, despite the fact that we're in a war of choice with one country that can bring down the entire world economy.
I mean, I'm amazed at how well behaved the bond market has been, the 10-year staying right around in a range in spite of a lot of different concerns about debt and inflation and everything else.
Well, as you know, that we've had two earnings seasons in a row where basically everything's surprising on the upside. That's happening because the golden age that President Trump promised is starting to be very visible in the profit data, but also more importantly in the wage data.
Okay, so that's COVID Kev talking with MAGA Joe from CNBC about how the stock market and the bond market are doing great because Donald Trump is so transparent. And the big beautiful bill is putting money in everyone's pockets. The world is just going to flock to the U.S. for oil and that we're in a quote-unquote golden age. Okay, now let's hear from Rick Rieder from BlackRock. It's not my favorite company, but I happen to like this guy in particular.
Actually, the parts of the economy and the primary drivers are doing quite well. You look at tech, you look at some of the numbers yesterday that you cited, and you look at these earnings growth. I was looking at some of the semis. You're talking about 97% earnings growth year on year. Unbelievably powerful numbers. And then you look at, the high-end consumer, that consumption. You look at retail sales when you break it down. Pretty darn good. So you've got an economy, and by the way, you've got, housing's not in good shape, lower income's not in good shape. So that is what it is. But what drives the equity market is in pretty good shape. And the technicals, so you had this period of time that nobody wanted to buy stocks, and then you realize, I've said it before, you're going to have an IPO calendar this year that maybe is a couple $100 billion, maybe. We're going to buy back $1 trillion of stock this year. So we're actually, there's not enough stock to buy.
All right, so a few things to unpack here before we dig even deeper into what's propping up the market. First off, you might have winced, as I did, when he kind of shrugged off the lower end of the market. Now, believe it or not, he's usually a lot more careful and not that cavalier. But if you key into what he says about the high-end consumer and listen closely to the implications behind what he calls the technicals, you can get a pretty honest assessment of what's going on right now. That's what I'm going to dig into in a moment. But there was another less talked about and extraordinary moment in this interview that really caught my attention. And it's when he talked about the slow IPO calendar and the near $1 trillion in scheduled stock buybacks that are shrinking the pool of available stocks. Here's something we don't talk about enough. Stock buybacks were effectively illegal in this country until 1982. So it's not ancient history. That's the beginning of the Reagan administration. So the SEC issued Rule 10b-18, which gave companies a safe harbor to repurchase their own shares without being charged with market manipulation. And that single regulatory decision cracked open a door that corporate America has been driving semi-trucks through ever since. Now, before that, companies returned value to shareholders like they always had, through dividends. You own a piece of the company makes money, you get a little cut. Pretty simple. Buybacks changed the equation entirely. So instead of sharing profits, The company uses its cash, or more often borrowed cash, to buy back its own shares. And fewer shares outstanding means that earnings per share goes up, even if the company didn't actually earn a single dollar more. The stock price just keeps going up as a result. And the executives, and you have Bill Clinton to thank for this, the executives whose compensation is tied to the stock price get even richer. So technically, the underlying business could even be shrinking, and it wouldn't necessarily impact the share price. This is basically financial engineering at its finest. And if you want a number to put it into perspective, look up something called the Buffett indicator. It's the total U.S. stock market capitalization divided by GDP. Warren Buffett himself said that anything over 100% was playing with fire. Right now, we're at about 200%. And S&P companies have been buying back more than $1 trillion of their own stock every single year. Apple alone repurchased over $700 billion in its own shares since 2012. $700 billion. It's just not investing in new products or not paying out to workers, just used to make the stock price go up. And maybe that's why Tim Cook is leaving. He cooked the books until they were well done. So when Reader talks about nearly $1 trillion in buybacks, this is going to have another enormous impact on the price to earnings ratio, which marks performance in sectors that aren't as flush, let's say, as like the tech sector, right? But there's more to it when it comes to the stock market. The PE ratio, that's price to earnings, is the standard way to tell whether a stock is cheap or expensive. And when you artificially inflate the earnings per share number through buybacks, the PE looks more reasonable than it actually is. The market looks fairly valued, but it isn't. The S&P 500 forward PE is hovering around 20 to 22 times right now, already elevated by historical standards. And if you strip out the so-called Magnificent Seven, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, and Tesla, the rest of the index looks a lot less magnificent. And every one of these companies have, of course, been buying back stocks aggressively. But here's what really makes this machine run. It's not just the buybacks. I recently did a piece for UNFTR laying out the full scale of government money that has flooded corporate America since 2008. And here's what I found out when I added it all up. So to do this right, let's go back to when everything really hit an inflection point in 2008, right as the financial crisis was beginning to blow. So everything pretty much started with TARP. You might remember it. It's where $475 billion went into the banking system to prop up the very banks that blew up the global economy. And the banks wound up getting whole, but the homeowners didn't. But that's just the headline number. That's just the stuff that we could see. Running in parallel, the Federal Reserve was quietly committing roughly, ready? $7.7 trillion across a constellation of emergency facilities just to keep the financial system breathing. I mean, AIG, the big insurer, they alone got $182 billion. Remember, the auto industry got $80 billion as well. Now, mind you, there's a lot of continuity here between the team that was managing the very end of the Bush years and the team that was managing the first term for Obama. And they worked hand in hand to make sure that all of this money went through the system. So Obama picked up on all of that running in the background with the Federal Reserve and then had a fiscal stimulus plan to pour $831 billion into the economy through the ARRA. And it was real money for real things. It was propping up state budgets to make sure that states didn't collapse. It was propping up the unemployment rolls because we had, massive unemployment above 10% at the time. And it sent some infrastructure spending into the economy to pave roads and just kind of get people working again. Now skip forward to COVID. Trump signs the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion. And inside that bill was $350 billion in forgivable loans to businesses through the PPP program. $25 billion in grants to the airlines. That was one of 3 bailouts that they got, by the way. $17 billion for national security industries and $500 billion to supercharge Federal Reserve lending. So the Fed's balance sheet at that time went from about $4 trillion to $7 trillion almost overnight. And for the first time in its 107-year history, The Federal Reserve went into the open market to buy corporate bonds as well. You're talking about $14 billion worth of corporate bonds from companies like Apple, AT&T, and Microsoft. I mean, that's a line that we crossed that nobody really talked about because, all hell was breaking loose across the globe. Now, PPP across all rounds was about $950 billion authorized, but $800 billion of it was forgiven. Then Biden comes in with the American Rescue Plan, another $1.9 trillion. The infrastructure bill, another $1.2 trillion. The CHIPS Act, $52 billion in direct semiconductor subsidies. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act had a true cost that ballooned from the original estimates to somewhere around $2 trillion over 10 years. And nobody really knows, but that's by design. So if we go by administration, roughly $8 trillion at the tail end of Bush and into Obama's tenure, mostly Fed spending, $831 billion new spending under Obama, $4 to $5 trillion in direct fiscal spending under Trump's first term, plus trillions more in Fed backstops, by the way, and $4.3 trillion across 4 bills under Biden. So if you total it up, this is $10 to $12 trillion in direct investments, direct commitments, right? That's before you count anything that the Fed did off the books. So it's worth noting, by the way, that just by the numbers on the fiscal side of the equation, if you strip out the Fed interventions, technically, the most profligate spender between all of these administrations was Trump 1.0. But he floods the zone with so many distractions, and the Democrats can't shake this tax and spend moniker that we never talk about it. So when you think about the market, there's a reason why it just can't seem to lose, no matter what we throw at it. A global financial crisis, a global pandemic, now a war and an oil shock that's bigger than the embargoes in the 1970s, and it's rocking Asian economies and working its way across the planet toward us like a comet. The U.S. equity market is running on the fumes of monetary policy and maneuvers and corporate fiscal stimulus, unlike anything that the world has ever seen. Now, in conjunction with buybacks that shrink the investment pool and mechanically inflate values, these corporations are literally playing with the house's money. They're not building and growing so much as they're circulating and recirculating all this free government cheese through their own swimming pools of cash. So the stock market is no longer a reliable barometer of economic health to the extent that it ever was one. It's a scoreboard, right? It's a scoreboard for how efficiently large corporations can just capture government subsidies, Fed backstops, and cheap borrowed money, and then recycle it into the share price. So when the Dow goes up, it doesn't mean the economy's doing well. It means that the machine is doing its job. It's effectively processing free money like gas in the tank. Now, occasionally, this money leaks out to the broader economy, like when, they need their pools serviced and the deck needs power washing, but mostly, we're just all here to maintain the lifestyles of the rich and famous at this point. That's what Reader's pointing out by saying that the technicals are A-OK in the equities market and even in the bond market at this point. None of this has anything to do with the real economy. It has everything to do with the economy, though, that the financial news networks and by extension, the rest of the mainstream media really care about. So the next time you see Kevin Hassett sitting there with that stupid grin telling you we're in a golden age, run it against your own experience. Just check your grocery bill, look at your rent, open up your credit card statement. Think about the last time that a raise actually felt like a raise. So if your bullshit detector's going off, if what you're hearing doesn't square with what you're living, trust your gut, because you're not crazy. You're not missing anything. The gap between what they're telling you and what you're experiencing is real. And know that it's all very much by design. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can follow me on Blue Sky or subscribe to my YouTube channel at UNFTR. We also produce that free weekly newsletter with original essays, economic analyses, must-read headlines, and more. Just go to UNFTR.com to sign up. Thank you to the Meidas Mighty for having me here, and I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.